Hi, I'm Stephen Van Tassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast for Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Van Tassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope your week is going well. I'm recording actually midweek at this moment, so had a little bit of traveling over the Memorial Day weekend. I hope you took a few moments to think about those who sacrificed for our country, and certainly it was a kind of a somewhat refreshing time for me. Went to the western end of the state, so kind of enjoyed myself over there. And it's kind of interesting seeing the number of Canada geese that we're starting to get. So I'm looking forward to future wildlife damage management opportunities that are growing here in the great state of Montana. And I trust that you're looking for new opportunities as well. So do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, make sure you're keeping up to date to our podcast here. Of course, I'm part of the Pest Geek podcast family, but I have my own show here, of course, and so we'd love to have you on board. Do join us as well on Facebook. You can reach us, of course, at Pest Geek Podcast on Facebook. Join the revolution, as Franklin says it. So we'd love to hear from you there. We can talk about your triumphs and trials and just talk shop there in an affirming environment for you, especially for newcomers. By all means, definitely learn. You can learn a lot just even from lurking, even if you don't have questions asked. Of course, I'm always open to getting comments from my audience. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Thoughts for shows, perhaps people do interviews with, new products, something that's maybe on your mind, or even criticisms. Would love to hear from you even about that as well. Because if we're not open to criticism, how do we improve? Sure. Otherwise, if I don't hear from you, as I've said so many times before, I'll just talk about things that I think that interest me, that I come across. And so far, I guess many people have been enjoying that, so I'm grateful for your support. What are we going to talk about this week? Well, I came across an article that I saw about armadillos. Now, I think armadillos are just really cool. And unfortunately, I've never had the privilege of doing any control for armadillos, but those of you in the southern states certainly have that opportunity, and they can, of course, be incredibly destructive to grass, people's turf. Of course, you have those people out there that just love their turf and that sort of thing. So you may want to also control armadillos because of the damage that they can do to ground nesting birds. For those of you working perhaps in hunting camps or areas in the south, you have a lot of areas that are just basically areas for private hunting parks, and so certainly that would be one animal. Typically people think of coyotes and raccoons, and certainly they will do their damage, of course, on ground nesting birds as well, but armadillos can work on ground nesting birds as well, and of course the aesthetic challenges that are caused by armadillos. Armadillos also have some issues with Chagas disease, so I haven't heard anything about whether they're a source of Chagas disease here in the United States. Chagas disease is primarily a Central American disease, although it is coming into our country, and so that's something we probably want to need to monitor over time, especially because if it hits our blood supply, they do test for it, but that's certainly a serious condition indeed. But for this week, we're not going to be getting into the diseases on armadillos. Of course, there's leprosy, or I think they call it Hansen's disease, if memory serves. So certainly you want to be careful that when you're handling armadillos, of course, you don't want to contract that particular bacterial disease either. But we're going to talk about an article that I came across about a different way to capture armadillos, and I thought I would talk about that this week. So if you don't have armadillos in your area, you never know. They've come as far north as Nebraska. So armadillos have a wider range sometimes than people realize. In fact, some of the literature you can actually see the biologists saying, "Yep, armadillos have made it to the U.S. and made it to my state, excuse me." And you could see how their range has sort of expanded here in the United States. So who knows? Because historically we never had opossums, for example, up in Canada, but now we do. So don't just assume that just because I don't have armadillos, what do I need to learn about armadillos? You never know when something might change. Okay, so certainly if that's not a high priority for you, well then you can certainly pass on, and we'll catch you then next time. But for those of you in the South that have some armadillo issues, this is certainly an interesting technique that you might want to consider. So let me pull up my PowerPoint slide here, and let's get this thing started here. So let's take a look. Okay, so all right, so this is an article. And let me give you the authors that are involved where I got this information. So this isn't something I've come up with on my own. As many of you know, I do read academic literature, consult it, and try to pass that on to you. So certainly there's a limit to what I learn, but we're not learning unless we continue to stretch ourselves and to go into different areas. And so this is one of the ways you can do that. So this is an article by David L. Bergman, Robert D. Blewett, and Alan R. Tipton, and the title of their article is An Alternative Method for Capturing Armadillos. And that was published in the Southwestern Naturalist Journal, Volume 40, Issue 4, December of 1995, pages 414 through 416. So a very short article. If you're familiar with the Naturalist magazine journals, they're only like 6 by 8. They're not very large journals. They're not like 8.5 by 11 full page, but there's kind of like half page size, and so and no pictures, right? So it's not even a full page on the first page, and I'm not even sure it's a full page on the last page. So it is a very, very short article, but I wanted to sort of highlight what they talked about. So what they mentioned here are the ways that scientists have often used to capture armadillos. And they would say, okay, sometimes we'd capture them by hand, just run up and grab them, I guess, if that's what you can do. Like I said, I've never captured an armadillo, so I'll just take them at the word, just capturing them by hand. Another method is using a hand net. So it's sort of a large fishing type net, and you just simply come up to them and drop it over them and scoop them up. And I've certainly done that with raccoons when I was involved with the raccoon rabies epidemic that occurred in Massachusetts back in the mid-90s. A very good way. It's a lot easier sometimes to do that than handling with a catch pole, for example. Also, another way of capturing armadillos is using a baited cage trap. Now, baiting armadillos, if you heard a previous podcast that I did, that is sort of like the holy grail. Can we find a bait that will really work on armadillos? And unfortunately, all the literature that I've read, and I can't say that I've seen all of it, but I've seen a little bit, not a lot of articles on baiting armadillos, right, with lures, and none of them work in the sense of that they're any better than any other bait. It's just there's no, like when we talk about catching mice, what do people say? Peanut butter, right? Well, that's a hot bait for mice. It's not the only bait for mice, but that is really a go-to bait for mice. We have no go-to bait for armadillos, at least nothing that's been scientifically demonstrated to be more effective. An alternative, of course, for capturing armadillos is the drift net fences with cage traps. Now, you may have seen this as basically you're creating a fence to funnel the armadillo into a cage. So if you have a 2-door cage, you basically create wings, and there's no bait. You just simply funnel the armadillo into the trap because they just sort of roam around and following a trail, and it guides them into the trap, and bang, you caught your armadillo. That's a very effective method, especially for those of you working on residential properties where you don't have a lot of land to work with anyways, and so you can kind of funnel that armadillo into your trap. You can also use footholds for those parts of the country where footholds would be legal for that, and where it's wise to do it. You always have to be thinking about domestic pets as well. However, the last method is the one that this particular group of people have focused on, and that's called the dogs and trap combo, and very interesting. So what they use is dogs along with traps to capture armadillos. So let's talk about what they mean by that. So here's what they do. They take dogs that are trained in a similar manner that are used to capture raccoons. So if you have like an old raccoon dog that's used, this would be sort of a similar animal, and it's basically the training technique. Instead of training it to go after raccoons, you're training the dog to key in on the armadillo. And once you have that kind of a dog, you then go out and you look into large landscape areas, and they basically search somewhere between 1,700 and 2,400 hours. So that would be about 5 o'clock to midnight. And what they would do is they would try to find those holes. They would let the dogs loose, and the dogs would then go find armadillos. And if they were chasing the armadillo would often run into a hole, and then the dog would identify whether that hole was occupied by an armadillo. Alternatively, the dog would be perhaps even corner an armadillo, perhaps maybe it got trapped somewhere. But nevertheless, the dog is identifying what hole has an active armadillo. And then you would set a trap to go after that particular armadillo in that hole. Now, what the researchers found was that the best times to do this type of work was at dusk and nightfall. Not sure exactly difference. I would say dusk is probably around sunset, when the sun starts going down. It gets a little, where the ground gets probably a little darker, but you're still seeing a bright sky. They also found temperature mattered. They typically wanted to do the work between 70 and 79 degrees Fahrenheit. Part of the reason for that was they wanted to make sure the dogs didn't overheat. So armadillos, of course, were active at that temperature, but also that you didn't want your dog overheating as well. They also wanted a humidity of over 50%. And I would suspect the reason for that was not only the comfort of the armadillo, but also humid air carries odor better than dry air. And so those of you in the South certainly have a ton of humidity, to be sure. And they also wanted a period where things were partly overcast to fully overcast. And again, probably it's more of an issue of lower wind issues as well, and also keeping your dog cooler. And it may have been helpful for the armadillo activity as well. And so those were the conditions that they found the best times to search for armadillos. Now you may say, well, Stephen, how is this going to be applicable for my business when I'm not going out and removing armadillos from a large landscape? Granted, that's certainly something that a lot of wildlife control operators do. However, you may be in a situation where you're asked to remove armadillos over a large landscape. In this case, you're having a dog. Many of you in wildlife control have dogs that go with you in your jobs. This may be something your dog, if he's sort of like a terrier or something, he likes to key in on animals and like a hound, then this may be something you can get your dog to add into his portfolio and take advantage of this particular opportunity. Because, as I said before, there's no real bait to lure an armadillo into your trap. So if you can solve this job more quickly, then that puts more money, of course, into your wallet. So here's the process again to kind of illustrate this visually for you. So the dog locates an active armadillo burrow where he knows an armadillo's still inside that hole. You then, as the trapper, come along with a large trap. Now, the traps that they were using here are certainly what I would think is larger than normal. Understand that a lot of biologists aren't as competent trappers as my audience is, of course. I would suspect you can get away with a trap that's certainly smaller than 42 inches, but for some reason, that's what they used. I'd love to get feedback from those of you that have a lot more armadillo experience than I do. Perhaps you have an opinion on that particular thing. Again, you can reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your idea on that. And then they would use a 12-inch tall fence made of 1x2 mesh. And they would anchor that around the trap, including the hole. So the idea being when the armadillo comes out, he's directed, of course, into the cage trap. Now, my personal opinion would be it might be better to have a 2-door cage trap. Make sure that your trap is durable and strong. Perhaps make sure you're getting a professional series. My understanding is armadillos can really beat up some of your cheaper made traps. You want something that's going to be heavy duty, but perhaps a 2-door trap might make it easier for the armadillo to see a way out and then be less likely to dig underneath the fence. Interestingly enough, they only had one loss of a armadillo by the armadillo bypassing because they said the fence wasn't secured to the ground properly. So it seems that the armadillos really weren't looking for a way to dig underneath the fence, so they didn't have that trap shyness per se. So it seems that this was pretty straightforward for them. But they secured the trap around to the hole to force the armadillo, of course, into the trap. And that's basically how this whole process worked. Now, what they found is that the dogs worked best between the temperatures of 64.4 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that may be kind of tough for some of you in the South, particularly if you're working during the summertime. So I suspect this was probably a wintertime activity. And they said this allowed the dogs to work for 2 hours. Now, if you're not dealing with large acreages, this is less of an issue of a concern for your dog overheating, of course. So let me go back to that previous slide. So armadillos like to be active between 70 and 79 degrees Fahrenheit, and the dogs can get up to 75 degrees. But again, you can have a dog working at hotter temperatures, of course. You just have to be careful about how long your dog is working and how much of I know dogs don't necessarily sweat, but whether your dog's going to be overheating. You just want to make sure of that. And you also want to make sure that the wind speed is less than 20 miles per hour. Now, 20 miles per hour is a pretty strong wind speed because, again, you want to be sure your dog is able to pick up the scent. So if it's too windy, the dog is going to get lost, and there's no use using the dog in that particular situation when you're dealing with large acreage. And so that is basically this particular technique, the dog trap combo. So this may be just another type of a technique that some of you may be able to use and incorporate into your system for looking for situations when you have armadillos on someone's property or perhaps some acreage, and how can you resolve that job more quickly rather than sort of guessing whether the armadillo's in a particular burrow or not. So let me go back over the authors again and make sure I give them appropriate kudos for this particular research. Again, this is by David L. Bergman, that's Bergman, and then Robert D. Blewett, that's Bluett, and Alan R. Tipton, Tipton. And the article's title is called An Alternative Method for Capturing Armadillos. And that was published in Southwestern Naturalist Journal, Volume 40, Issue 4, December 1995, pages 414 to 416. Hope that is something that those of you that have armadillos in your area, and perhaps you have a dog that's a good enough hound that can pick up armadillo scent and follow your cues to find those active burrows. Hope that puts more money into your pocket. So I just thought it was a fascinating concept there, and something that could really turn around a job much more quickly for those of you that have to handle armadillos. So I'm Stephen Van Tassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. If you don't like dealing with YouTube, you can download my podcast over at Rumble. Just go to Wildlife Control Consultant under Rumble, and you can find my podcast there. I tend to upload even faster than what occurs through YouTube, and would love to hear from you. You can also reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Again, would love to hear from you, even criticisms, comments, thoughts, anything you have there. I would love to hear from you. If you have ideas for different shows, would love to hear that as well. I'm always looking for individuals who have something interesting to offer the audience. So if you want to be on the show, definitely reach out. I typically record at around 4 o'clock Mountain Time or on the weekend, so we can schedule that particular time for you. So again, this is Stephen Van Tassel, part of Living the Wildlife, part of the Pest Geek podcast family. And why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.